Black Kiwis, genuine Kiwis, do not deport your people and your problems.
If you're convicted, once you've done your time, we send you home.
Despite that tough talk from Jacinda Ardern, the Australian government now wants to expand its powers to deport people born in New Zealand. The controversial Australian policy already allows the government to deport people who've been sentenced to more than 12 months in prison, regardless of how long they've lived in Australia. But Scott Morrison's government now wants to expand that so that anyone convicted of a crime with a potential sentence of 2 years or more can also be deported. Now that includes children. And I asked Australian Human Rights Commissioner Edward Santow why he thinks the Australian government is getting even tougher.
Well, Australia has had a policy for a long time now that anyone with a significant criminal record or even just a criminal connection who's not an Australian citizen will be sent back to their original country. And so there's been, I guess, incremental steps along the way to tighten those laws.
Why do they need to extend them?
Well, we say that those laws are already very strict and that they shouldn't be extended. I guess what the Australian government says is that any risk to the community of a criminal causing harm is unacceptable. Of course, we would accept the idea that you can deport the most dangerous non-citizens from our country, but what we would also say is you have to have a sense of proportion. So there are people who are not dangerous criminals who are being removed from Australia, and that can have a terrible, devastating impact, not just on them as individuals, but also on their families.
Almost 2,000 New Zealanders have been deported since these laws came into place in 2014. Is there any way of knowing exactly how many New Zealand-born people might be affected if these laws are indeed extended?
We don't know the precise figure, but the Australian Department of Home Affairs has said that if this legislation goes through, they expect that there will be a larger number of people who will be able to be removed from Australia. And that's something that really causes us significant concern, because right now in our immigration detention centres, New Zealand makes up the second largest group of people, non-citizens, who are being detained.
To be clear, under this legislation as it is proposed, children would be eligible for deportation.
Yeah, you could have a range of people, not just adults, but also younger people as well, who could be deported.
Can you tell us then, what are your main concerns with the 501 clause as it stands?
So that provision was introduced basically to protect our community from some of the most hardened criminals that could cause the Australian community harm. And we accept that general principle. But over time, it's been expanded, and now it's not even necessary that someone has committed an offence. The government might form the view that someone is at risk of committing crime in Australia, or might have some association with a criminal organisation, and that would be enough to remove them from Australia. What we say is it's a very, very significant act to send someone away from Australia, particularly if they've been here for a significant period of time. And you need to take a more holistic approach where you take into account what is the true risk to the Australian community, but also what is going to be the negative impact on the individual who's deported and their friends, and particularly their family, and especially their dependent children if they have any here.
Our Human Rights Commissioner says disproportionately Māori and Pacific Island people are being deported from Australia to New Zealand, and that shows some sort of ethnic bias. Would you agree with that?
Well, it's certainly the case that when we inspect immigration detention centres, we see a significant proportion of Maori and Pacific Islander people in those detention centres. We don't have access to the statistics, so we can't be certain about that, but unquestionably there's a large number of Maori.
What are conditions like in those detention centres?
So Australia's immigration detention centres are tough places to spend time. The first thing to be aware of is that over the last few years they've become more and more like a typical prison. And so what that means is that you'll generally have two people in a room, which is like a cell. They'll often be in bunk beds, and those rooms are quite small. Most commonly, there is no divide in that room between where you're sleeping. There's no door or anything like that between where you sleep and where you actually go to the bathroom. So just to be really explicit about it, you'll have a toilet and maybe a shower facility that there's no actual formal dividing door or wall between those two places. So that's the kind of thing that makes those places really quite difficult environments. And yes, you can have visitors come, including family, but they're not the most easy places for having family and particularly kids come and spend some time. I mean, I've got young children myself. I wouldn't want to have my own kids there coming regularly and frequently because it's not the kind of environment that you would generally want to keep kids in.
Whether in the detention centres or in the broader deportation process, are people's human rights being breached?
So we've got real concerns about people's human rights in the detention centres themselves. And the first problem is that the average period that someone is held in an Australian Immigration Detention Centre right now is approximately 496 days. That is a huge, huge period. It's many orders of magnitude greater than any other comparable country of the world. Just by way of comparison, the average period that someone might be detained in an immigration detention centre in Canada is just over 12 days, and we're at 496. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that the longer that you spend in an immigration detention facility, the harder it is to maintain good health, good mental health, and general well-being. And so what we see in our immigration detention inspections is that there are increasing problems the longer that people stay there, particularly when it comes to their health and mental health and their connections to their close family and the people that love them.
At this stage, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison is maintaining a hardline stance. So what options do you have?
Well, so we have primarily the powers of persuasion. We can say really clearly what we see through our immigration detention inspection processes, and we can also comment, as we've done in the Parliament itself, on proposals for changing our law.
Let me ask this though,
ultimately it's a decision for government.
Does the Australian public care?
I think they do. I think people understand that Australia has long had quite strong border protection laws and policies, and they are to keep the community safe. But my sense when I speak to people in the community, as I have been all morning today, is that people also want a sense of balance and proportion. And we have always been a country that have welcomed immigrants, and we need to make sure that in protecting our community, we're not having a disproportionate effect that's causing harm on some groups.
Balance and proportion was the request from New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, of course, when she met with her Australian counterpart. Is that likely to have any impact on this government's plans?
Well, I mean, I'm not a political animal, and those political questions are way above my pay grade. All I can say is that the principle of this is fundamentally important. Australia is always a country that has spoken, I think, very powerfully about the importance of freedom, equality and human rights. And we always have to be held to account to make sure that we're living up to those values. And I think it's really, really helpful that in international forums like the United Nations, that Australia is held to account.
Here in New Zealand, the main opposition party, National, says it would consider implementing a similar law in New Zealand that would see people who were born in Australia deported back to Australia unless Australia relaxes its policy. What would you think of that approach?
Well, obviously I can't comment on New Zealand politics. That would get me into more trouble than I'm already used to. But what I can say is that New Zealand has a really interesting set of laws right now, which essentially say that the longer you've been in New Zealand, the harder it is to deport you, because it recognises that the longer that you're in a country, the more ties you have to that country, and the greater harm it will cause if you are deported. So we have said to the Australian Parliament that that is precisely the sort of law that we should be looking at, because it's more balanced, it's more proportionate, and it's better able to protect the Australian community while without causing too much harm to others.